I've always referred to these bad boys as Q rings,
Right.
but I guess a more technically accurate name is an oval chainring because there's different types. There's Jet Black makes them and used to be made by Osymmetric and that kind of thing. But these are
You've been running them for quite a long time?
a very long time. These are mine. I think this is the second set that I've run, and I think I've had them on my bikes in one form or another since 2012.
Wow.
So, yeah, I've been running them for a long time. I basically bought a pair of them a long time ago because they look cool, stuck them on the bike, thought they felt horrible for about 10 minutes and then forgot all about them and just stuck with them ever since. And we've had a lot of people in the comment section asking me about these because you don't see that many people using Q rings anymore. It's basically me and Froome. And I don't think they're doing as much for me as they are for Froomey.
Okay.
Yeah, but maybe they are, and that's just, I'd be even worse without them. But I've been running them for a long time, so I've got a fair bit of experience with using them. Recently, I had to go away from these because I was trying to get some replacements for these because they just wore down eventually. And it became very hard to find 130 BCD 53-39 combination in the style that I needed. So I went back to a round chainring and I thought this is probably a good time to basically adapt back out of them and see what the difference was. And I was at a pretty good level with my training and my fitness and everything. So it was good to see some of the stuff
level.
I didn't suddenly become a World Tour pro when I moved away from it, and I didn't get a lot worse either.
Okay.
But that sort of mirrors my experience with them over the years. But we'll talk a bit about what they are and how they work. So the idea is, right, you imagine your crank arm here. As you come over the top of the stroke, the chainring dynamically changes its circumference, right? So at the top of the stroke, when it's horizontally, like an ellipsoid like this placed horizontally, you will have a chainring that's probably around a 48 size. And then as you come over through the down stroke of the phase, as you start to apply downwards force to the pedal, that chainring is going to go up to probably around a 60-tooth size. And then it will dynamically, over the top of the stroke, come back again to the smaller chainring size. So essentially what this means is that your chainring is changing size with every pedal stroke. Now, the idea is that over the top of the stroke, you have an earlier application of power, right? So as the leg comes over and they start pushing down, the load comes on a bit earlier, and then the load will the rotational speed of the crank arm will slow down. So the rotational speed of a crank arm generally does vary through every pedal stroke anyway. On the downstroke, you tend to whip through the stroke a little bit quicker as you're applying force, and then over the dead spots, it does slow down. So it's a bit of a sine wave anyway. But the idea behind this is that it really slows down the leg speed on the power phase of the stroke. And the idea being essentially that you will have a longer period with which to apply force through the stroke on the downstroke. And this idea, I guess, is that you're slowing down the rate of muscle spindle contraction. So the muscle doesn't have to shorten. Let's talk about your quad, for example. It's a major one pushing down on the crank. It doesn't have to shorten as rapidly. So the muscle contraction goes slower. It has more time to generate that force, and it will change really rapidly over the dead spots of the stroke at the bottom. And on the power phase, it'll slow down. So that's the idea behind them. Look, there was this, if you read the claims on the manufacturer's websites, you'll get some stuff like, it decreases your O2 consumption and increases your efficiency and so forth and so forth. I did delve into the research surrounding these, and it's pretty bad. What I should say is it's sparse and it's poorly done in my experience. There were not many high quality studies showing proper effects, from an oval chainring compared to a round chainring. They also, all of them, and I mean all of them, none of them basically had any sort of adaptation period. And I would imagine if you're going to change to one of these things, there's an adaptation period where your muscle spindles are going to have to learn to fire differently. And that has definitely been my experience after 10 years of using this and then going back to this. There was an immediate large scale sense of, whoa, the stroke feels really different. So for me, when I went to a round chainring, I felt as if my leg was whipping really rapidly through the downstroke. Whereas before, to me, this always felt circular. This felt less circular. This felt like a chainring that was ovalized the wrong way. It felt like on the downstroke, my leg was whipping through the power phase of the stroke, and it actually didn't have time to apply force to the pedal, which in some sense means that this is giving me more time to apply force to the pedal. And that sensation, I've been running around chainring for about 3 months now, and it hasn't completely gone away. I'm still aware of it. So you need some decent adaptation time to get the most out of these. And that's what none of the research gives the athletes. They basically got a bunch of people, gave them VO2 testing or 1 minute flat out power testing, swapped the chain rings over and then did it again and measured the VO2 consumption and so forth and the efficiency and all of that kind of stuff. There was not a great adaptation phase. And I think if you're going to research this, you probably need to give people's motor patterning a proper adaptation phase, 6 weeks or so of riding around on them and then retest. The difficulty with that is it then introduces other variables to the test. Like basically they might be a bit fitter 6 weeks later or less fit, or they haven't slept as much, or they've slept more, or they're in better condition or worse condition. There's a lot of other variables. It becomes really difficult to test O2 consumption and efficiency with all those other variables. So the annoying answer to the question of do they work is we don't really know. I reckon, to me, these things feel more circular than this. And I get a nicer feel out of that. However, the longer I ride them, the more normal these feel. So that the effect certainly diminishes with adaptation, right? So my neuronal patterning in my legs is getting more and more used to the round ring, and it's starting to become less of a psychological thing that I notice, right? I have done some testing on them, and I don't believe I've been able to measure any type of change. If there was a change in power output, I would imagine it would be at sort of VO2 or FTP or slightly sub FTP type oxygen consumption, but it's so small that I haven't been able to measure it in myself. So
Right.
Not that a single person counts as a decent sample size anyway, but I haven't been able to perceive a change in power, although these certainly feel nicer to me.
Right.
Now, the main limitation to your cardiovascular performance is always cardiac, right? So you and I feel burn in our legs when we go really hard. We like to think it's our legs packing up, but in reality, it's acidosis or lactate, which is building up in our muscles because of a lack of circulation, right? So your cardiac ability, your ability to transfer oxygen and nutrients to your muscles by the the arteries and the veins in your body, your oxygen transference from your lungs, your stroke output of your heart. These are the main limitations to cardiovascular performance. So when you change something locally in the leg, like this, change the style of the pedal stroke very slightly, you don't see a lot of variation in power output. It's the same reason you don't see a lot of variation in power output and efficiency with huge crank length changes. There's been research done on like cranks from 185 right down to 145 millimeters, and the person kind of puts out the same power. It's because the major limitation is not in your legs, it's always here. It's your heart and your lungs, right? Cycling is a cardiovascular sport unless we're talking about sprinting. That's a little bit of a different kettle of fish. But if we're talking about cardiovascular performance, the limitation is here. So I wouldn't imagine that these things play a great role in terms of actually changing things in the leg, which are going to have a large effect on your cardiovascular power output. Because the limitation, once again, is here, heart and lungs, essentially. So that's been my experience with them. They have been a really good thing generally. I really like the feel of them. Why do I like the feel of them, and why do other people hate them? This is a good question. My theory with this, the people that benefit the most from these things, I think it's people with large dead spots at the top of the stroke. So as your leg is coming around, the crank arm comes through the bottom. As the force comes off the pedal, before the other leg starts to pull or starts to push down, there's a dead zone, a spot where the force on both the pedals is really low, very close to zero. We call that the dead zone of the stroke, right? These things, if you have a large dead zone, these things, as you come back over onto the power stroke, it tends to initiate the relief of the dead zone into the power zone a little bit better. So a little bit earlier is a better way of thinking about it with crank rotation. So I think these things eliminate dead zones a little bit. And if you've got a really big dead zone, you feel them more. Who has the biggest dead zones in my experience? Heel droppers. I'm a massive heel dropper. So as I come over the top of the stroke, my ankle just drops. And as it drops, the crank is rotating as I apply force, but I then start applying force to the pedal very late in the stroke. And so my dead zone at the top is larger than someone who doesn't do that. If your ankle stays really rigid, your dead zone is not as severe.
Like a toe pointer.
A toe pointer, a person with a more rigid ankling technique.
I'm a toe pointer.
You're a toe pointer.
Yeah.
We'll splice some footage of you. Label it Twinkle Toes. You are a ballet dancer in a past life, mate. And I'm the polar opposite.
Yeah.
So I think that people who are big heel droppers like these things. That's been my experience with them. We should briefly mention that they shift fairly badly because of the ovality of them. It's a bit of an acquired skill shifting these things reliably without dropping the chain. If you try and drag the derailleur across when it's in its maximum height, it's not great. So I very rapidly learned when to shift as my right leg was coming up through the dead zone. I would just learn to intuitively shift the derailleur at that time, and I didn't drop my chain that much, but other people say that they're dreadful. And I think if you don't time the shift on the front derailleur well, the shifting is pretty iffy. Yeah, so that's definitely something to consider. Adapting in and out of them was, look, I've been on these things for about 12 weeks, round chain rings now, and I still don't feel like I've fully adapted out of them. So I think there is a long adaptation period. And that should definitely be taken into account. They certainly feel unusual when you first use them. And then after about 20 minutes or so, they're much less unusual, but the adaptation period goes on for a long time after that. In terms of positional adjustments, it is theoretically possible that if you reduce a person's dead zone at the top of the stroke, top and bottom, whichever way you want to think about it, whichever foot is at the top and whichever foot is at the bottom, you may get a little bit of an increased stability on the saddle. So the person may not rock as much, they may not bounce as much, and they may feel lighter on their hands because of the slower contractile effort on the downstroke through the hamstring and everything. So it's possible that you will have to possibly move your seat slightly forward because you'll be elevating your weight off your hands a bit better with a curing than you otherwise were. And you may find that you need to potentially lower the bars slightly because you can operate with a lower torso angle. Not a big deal, not very measurable. Yeah, take that one with a grain of salt. But essentially I've found people tend to feel a little bit lighter on their hands when they use these, which is usually a good thing. You know, if you're a person who suffers with hand numbness and neck discomfort from being too heavy on the front end, these may make a tiny, tiny improvement to that. Okay. But no other large scale changes needed to the position. So that's been my experience with Q rings, mate. They're oval chain rings, but I use the Rotor Q rings, and they've been really good for me, but I just couldn't get them, and so I've had to come back to the round ones, and initially I hated it, and after 12 weeks, I'm kind of back on the fence again. So,
do you know why Froomey uses them?
He just likes the feel of them.
Okay.
Yeah, I've seen a few interviewers ask him about them, and guess why Froomey likes the feel of them? He's a heel dropper.
Oh, there you go.
He's a beanpole ectomorph heel dropper like me, and I think that's why he likes the feel of them.
Right.
That has been
so
my
the heel dropping component. If you're a heel dropper out there, yeah, it's worthwhile. Definitely worthwhile.
It could be. It could be. Yeah. I haven't met many people who drop their heels who go to them and don't like it.
Okay.
Yeah. I have met the odd person who's a really sort of neuromuscularly powerful person, a really heavily built, powerful person, and they are really rigid in their ankling, and they've used them and they haven't liked them.
Okay.
So, yeah, hence my experience with the heel droppers liking them.
All right. Well, thanks for sharing, mate. Much appreciated.
All good.